Epic battles are supposed to occur long ago and far away. But in city after city, an epic battle is going on right now. It's a battle about where you and your children will be allowed to live, where you will be allowed to work, and where and how you will be allowed to travel. It is a battle for your very lifestyle. It was started not so long ago by faraway, out-of-touch city planners and is spreading nationwide. In city after city, planners are imposing untested, experimental visions about the ideal city lifestyle on an unsuspecting public. Few people even know that an experiment is being done, or that they are the guinea pigs. This series explores these issues.
All right. Well, some of you know that I grew up in Portland, and then I moved away for college, and then I had a career outside of Portland. Then I came back after about 20 years, and Portland had been completely changed. And most of the changes were for the worse. I will tell you, this isn't part of my slideshow, I don't drink beer, but the one positive change that Portland had was that they legalized the sale of beer on the premises on which it was made, which has made Portland the craft beer capital of the world. And Bend is a pretty close second. And that has revitalized downtown, that's revitalized neighborhoods, and yet the urban planners want to claim it's light rail and all of their plans that have done that. If they hadn't passed that law legalizing craft beer, Portland would be completely different. But I want to talk about light rail and what's happened in Portland. I talk to a lot of people and they say, well, you know, light rail might make sense somewhere, but like in Europe, but not in the United States because we don't have the density for it. Well, that's completely wrong. Light rail makes no sense anywhere on Earth, period. And here's why. 110 years ago, the main way of getting around cities was on foot or by streetcar. And at that time, less than 1% of Americans owned an automobile. Streetcars were expensive to build, but they were cheap to operate, so a lot of people took them to a lot of different places, mainly the middle class because they were too expensive. Even at a nickel fare, it was too expensive for working class people to ride. Then in the 1920s, the motor bus industry started developing buses. You notice this bus has a long hood. That's because engines at the time were very inefficient. So you had to have a really big gasoline engine powering this bus. This bus is about 30 feet long, but it only had 20 seats in it, 21 seats. So it was cheaper to start a new service using these buses than it was to build a streetcar line, but it cost more to run the buses than it cost to run streetcars. So you didn't see anybody tearing out streetcar lines, you just saw them extending service with buses instead of streetcars. Then in 1928 came the revolution. This bus is called the Twin Coach Model 40. It's the same length as the bus I showed you in the previous picture, but it has 40 seats on it because it doesn't have a big long hood sticking out. Instead, they put a much more advanced, smaller motor over the rear wheels. And so it was more efficient to run because the motor was smaller and it weighed less, and you could carry twice as many passengers, so your revenues were greater. So buses were now cheaper to operate than streetcars. They were cheaper to start up than streetcars. They're cheaper to maintain than streetcars. And so immediately, Albuquerque and Boise and San Antonio and hundreds of other cities began tearing out all their streetcar lines and replacing them with buses. So since 1928, streetcars have not made sense. They've not made any economic sense at all. Well, in the 1970s, somebody said, well, let's build some streetcars. And they said, oh, people think streetcars is old-fashioned, so let's call it light rail. It's still the same thing, but we'll call it light rail. Now you think light rail, oh, it must be cheap. It's lightweight because it's so cheap to build because it doesn't weigh much. Well, it turns out it's not lightweight. Light rail does not refer to the weight. Light rail cars actually weigh more than subway cars, which are known as heavy rail cars. Heavy rail car weighs about 85,000 pounds, and a light rail car weighs about 105,000 pounds. So light rail weighs more than heavy rail. So what makes it light? Well, it turns out, by definition, According to the American Public Transportation Association, light rail is light capacity rail. It's light capacity transit. Light rail is low capacity transit. So TriMet is all the time saying we need to have high capacity transit, so we need to build light rail. They're contradicting themselves. Light rail is low capacity transit. Well, why is it low capacity? You've got these big cars. Each car can hold 150 people. They have 70 seats, enough room for 80 people to stand comfortably. If you really cram them in, you might be able to get 130 people in, standees in there, so 200 people per car, and you can run trains. However, you can't run a train longer than a city block. And if you're in Salt Lake City, that's fine because city blocks are 400 feet long and a car is 100 feet long, so you can run 4-car trains. Portland has 200-foot long city blocks, so you can only run 2-car trains. So also, for safety reasons, you can only run about 20 trains an hour. So do the math. 300 or even 400 people times 20 trains an hour, for 400 people per 2-car train, means 6,000 to 8,000 people an hour moved via light rail. Okay? That's supposedly high capacity transit. Now for comparison, Portland, downtown Portland has the bus mall, right? The buses have one lane and the parking strip. And the bus mall is able to move 160 buses an hour. And if you use articulated buses, which a lot of cities have and Portland used to have, you can easily fit 100 people on these buses. So 160 buses an hour times 100 people per bus is 16,000 passengers an hour. That's twice as many as light rail. Now, I recently went to Europe and I got to see the Istanbul busway. Istanbul has a busway that goes down the middle of a freeway. It takes no more room than a light rail line. They run one bus every 14 seconds at rush hour. That means 257 buses an hour. They have big buses. They can hold, some of them can hold 200 people. But let's say they hold only 100 people, 250 buses an hour. They could probably actually do more than 250 buses an hour. But let's say 250 buses an hour times 100 people, 25,000 people an hour. So now we're talking 3 times the capacity of light rail. And that isn't even the most. Bogota, Colombia, has a busway with passing lanes. In the passing lanes, it takes more land than a regular busway or a light rail line, but you can move 50,000 people an hour down this busway, which is more than the New York City subways, more than any rail transit system in America. So buses can outperform trains easily. They're also far cheaper. You don't have to spend a lot of money on construction. Light rail was supposed to be a cheap form of rail transit. Some cities like San Francisco and Atlanta and Miami and Baltimore were building subways and they cost a lot of money. And so San Diego said, well, let's build a light rail line. And so they built one. It opened in 1981 and it cost $20 million a mile. Since then, the costs have just grown exponentially. The average light rail being built today is $160 million a mile. The cheapest one being built today or planned today is $100 million a mile. Seattle just got finished with one that cost $626 million a mile. The ones that Seattle wants to build are going to average $340 million a mile, and Los Angeles just convinced its voters to support one that's going to cost $900 million a mile for 11 miles. That's $10 billion for 11 miles. Meanwhile, Denver built some high occupancy toll lanes. That means extra lanes in a freeway that you can go on in a car if you have 3 or 4 people in your car, or if you have less, you can go on it if you pay a toll. And the buses can use it. So they have a bus that goes from Boulder to Denver, 41 miles an hour. That's twice as fast as light rail. And it relieved congestion because a lot of cars are using that lane, and the lane never gets congested because they raise the prices to make sure it doesn't get congested. And it's a great success. It didn't cost much to build. It's the only one that didn't have the only rail line, or the only transit line in Denver that didn't have a cost overrun, and the only one that didn't have a ridership shortfall. Also, buses are a lot safer than light rail. Light rail, in fact, is the most dangerous form of urban mechanized transportation. Kills 12 people per billion passenger miles. Buses and urban freeways only kill about 4 people per billion passenger miles. So I like to think of light rail as the diamond-encrusted Rolex watch of public transit. It costs a lot more. It doesn't do anything more than a regular watch. It does a lot less than a smartwatch, but it feeds the ego of the people who decided to get it. That's all it is for, really, is feeding the ego, and also you get some campaign contributions because somebody made some profits building it. So what's the enthusiasm behind light rail? Well, Metro had a transportation planner. He was the head of their transportation planning department named John Fregonese, and he was quoted in a Wisconsin paper saying, light rail is stupid. We're only building it to densify our neighborhoods. Now, how does that work? Well, the idea is they want to come into neighborhoods and rezone neighborhoods of single-family homes for apartments. But they get a lot of resistance from that. So if they build a light rail line through your neighborhood, then they say the federal government is requiring us to rezone you so that they'll have some people to ride the light rail. Metro has actually set a target. As of 1990, 65% of Portlanders lived in single-family homes. Their target is by 2040 to reduce that to 41%. There's only one city in America where less than 41% of people live in single-family homes. That's New York City. Everywhere else is more. So they want to make Portland to be as apartment-oriented as New York City. That's their target. So far, according to the Census Bureau, as of 2016, they've gotten the percentage of people living in single-family homes all the way down to 65.5%. In other words, they've failed completely. But their goal is to build light rail so they can build what they call transit-oriented developments. These are 4- and 5-story buildings, often with shops on the ground floor, such as this one. Oh, excuse me, that's not in Portland. That's actually in the former East Germany. Here's the one in Portland I was thinking of. That's over in the east side in Portland. Here's another one. Oh, excuse me, that's also from the former Soviet Union. Here's the one in Portland I was thinking of, high-rises. Now, when I associate planners with communists, I'm not trying to impugn the integrity of urban planners. I'm actually impugning the integrity of communists, because communism would have worked if they hadn't turned everything over to planners. Communism is supposed to be worker ownership of the means of production, right? Well, who's got the most worker ownership of the means of production in the world? Let's see, I went to an employee-owned grocery store the other day. I had some things shipped in on an employee-owned railroad. I flew on an employee-owned airline. I bought some plywood from an employee-owned plywood cooperative. We're the most communist country in the world, but it'll only work as long as we don't get the planners involved. So why are planners so set on density anyway? Well, it comes down to this guy. He was a nut. He was an architect in the 1930s. He called himself Le Corbusier. He was from Switzerland, the French part of Switzerland, and he's been called the Rasputin of the history, of the tale of urban planning. His idea was that everybody should have to live in high-rises. We should tear down entire cities and just build high-rises, and everybody should have to live in them. And for some reason, people believed him. And we had governments all over the world tearing down neighborhoods and building high-rises. This is in St. Louis. They tore down a bunch of single-family homes and put in high-rises. Well, they made the mistake of trying to tear down the neighborhood of an architectural critic in New York City named Jane Jacobs. And she got mad. She didn't want her neighborhood torn down and replaced with high-rises. So she wrote a book called The Death and Life of Great American Cities. How many people have heard of that book? Okay. It said two things. One of them was right, and the other was wrong. What she said that was right was that urban planners don't understand how cities work. And she was correct about that. Here's that St. Louis high-rise apartment building I showed you. They only kept it open for 17 years, and they couldn't get anybody to live in it, even for free, because it was so crime-ridden and such an awful place to live, so they ended up blowing it all up. Okay? Now, what Jane Jacobs said that was wrong was that Jane Jacobs, did understand how cities work. She was totally wrong about that. In fact, most of her book was wrong. She happened to live in Greenwich Village, Manhattan. Greenwich Village happened to be a neighborhood of 4- and 5-story buildings with ground floor shops. And she thought that was the epitome of urban living. So she based all her ideas on urban living based on this one neighborhood. And yet she didn't really understand that neighborhood at all. If there is any kind of housing in America that could be called evil, it would be the housing that's found in Greenwich Village. It was built in the 1880s. It was built for poor immigrants who had factory jobs but couldn't afford to take a streetcar to the factory, so they had to live in high-density housing. The factories would have 4,000 and 5,000 jobs per city block, and so you had to have 8,000, 10,000 immigrants living within walking distance of those jobs, because not all of those immigrants were workers. A lot of them were children or wives or whatever. So the developers built buildings that were called dumbbell buildings because they narrowed in the middle so that you could have a light shaft and an air shaft in them, and they got fat on the ends. And you can see it says on this diagram, it says parlor, living room, bedroom, 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 living room, parlor. So you can see it's apparently supposed to be a 4-unit apartment. You don't see any bathroom. There's one toilet on each floor for the people living in these 4-room apartments. But the reality was they weren't one family living per apartment. It was more like one family per room, maybe 8 people a room. And so you'd have 10 rooms or more per level with 8 people, 80 people sharing one toilet. And in 1890, a man took these pictures I'm showing you, and he wrote a book called How the Other Half Lives, and it made people irate, and it said, we have to get these working class people out of these neighborhoods and into low density neighborhoods so they can be a lot better off. Okay, so here's an aerial photo of Greenwich Village. See those buildings? Those are all dumbbell buildings. Greenwich Village is made up of the worst housing ever designed in America. Now, urban planners around the turn of the century wanted to get people out of there, but nothing they did worked. Instead, what happened was Henry Ford developed a moving assembly line to make his Model T Fords. That did 2 things. It allowed him to cut the price of his cars in half, but it also allowed him to double worker pay, which he did so that he could get a better quality of workers. And that made it possible for workers to buy their own cars. It also meant, because moving assembly lines took a lot of land, that factories moved away from downtowns where they had 4,000 jobs a city block to places where you might have 100 acres with a factory with a couple thousand jobs. So workers would buy their cars, they'd work at a factory, and then they'd buy a house. And home ownership just shot up. We had a 50% rise in home ownership after Henry Ford developed his car. Okay? So Henry Ford rescued us from Greenwich Village. Now we have a group called the Congress for the New Urbanism, and they want to return us to Greenwich Village. They say, whoops, what happened here? They say Jane Jacobs is their inspiration. They read Jane Jacobs and they realized, right, high rises are wrong, mid rises are right. We need to turn every suburb into a Greenwich Village. We need to turn every city into Greenwich Village. Everything has to be like Greenwich Village. They wrote something called the Charter of the New Urbanism. All development should be in the form of compact, that means 5 stories, walkable neighborhoods or districts. That means it's too congested for anybody to drive in. So because some crazy lady was trying to save her neighborhood against some crazy architect, suddenly everybody's neighborhood is being threatened to be turned into Greenwich Village. And when they build a light rail line, then their goal is to turn everything along that light rail line into Greenwich Village. So what are they doing in Portland? Well, of course, first of all, back in the 80s, they drew an urban growth boundary around the city. And the urban growth boundary was supposed to expand. Outside the boundary, you can't develop hardly at all. In fact, in most of rural Oregon, you can't put a house on your own land unless you own 80 acres, you actually farm it, and depending on soil productivity, you actually earn $40,000 to $80,000 a year farming it. So there have been almost no growth in rural areas. In fact, the population of rural Oregon has declined since 1980, and the population of urban Oregon, of course, has shot way up. Well, the original idea was they would expand the boundary when the population grew, but they did make some small expansions, but since they drew the boundary, the population of the Portland area has grown by 70%, and they've expanded it only by 6%. Instead, inside the boundary, their policy is densification. They come into neighborhoods, and they say, you are required to do your part to meet the planning targets for this city. That means we're going to rezone you for apartments. So if you've got a neighbor that's got a big backyard, they're allowed to put apartments in their backyard. If your house burns down, you're not allowed to rebuild it. You have to build an apartment. Now, for a while, they were encouraging row houses, but then they decided that row houses weren't dense enough. So now it's Greenwich Village. It's 4- and 5-story buildings popping up everywhere. Some of them even look like they're from Manhattan or Brooklyn or someplace like that. Well, what this has done is it's made housing expensive. Here's a 4-bedroom, 2-bath house with a family room on a 1/4-acre lot in Houston, Texas. You can buy that house for about $275,000. Same kind of a house in Dallas, $241,000. Now, counties in Texas aren't even allowed to zone, so they can't restrict anybody from building in rural areas in Texas. Atlanta, about the same price as in Dallas. Portland, twice as much. Twice as much. That's the cost of the urban growth boundary. That's what that is. It's just the cost of the urban growth boundary. Now, San Jose drew an urban growth boundary in 1974, and the courts in California have ruled that you can't expand your boundary at all without writing an environmental impact report, which costs $20 million. And nobody can afford to do that. So that same house in San Jose is over $1 million. It's been estimated that if you got rid of these rules, and just in San Jose and New York City, the gross domestic product of the entire United States would go up by almost 10%. So it's costing terribly. And you look around the country, and only a few coastal states have drawn urban growth boundaries or otherwise done some form of growth management. A few interior cities like Boulder, but mostly it's coastal. And those are the places that are expensive. You go back 50 years ago, no place was expensive. You could go to San Francisco, and it was priced only a little bit higher than Houston. And when you compare prices, the standard measure of affordability is the median home price divided by the median family income, or the value to income ratio. You can see it's around 2 or less everywhere. It was about 1.8 in Portland in 1969. Then we started drawing urban growth boundaries in some cities, and other cities didn't. So Houston and Atlanta are still cheap. Portland and Seattle are expensive. Los Angeles and San Francisco are super expensive. Now, somebody in 2002 did a comparison of San Jose versus Dallas to see what makes up the difference in costs. You can see most of the difference is in the price of land. Even though the house in San Jose is only on a 2,500 square foot lot and the house in Dallas is on a 7,000 square foot lot, the land for that 2,500 square foot lot cost $200,000 more in San Jose than the land for the 7,000 square foot lot in Dallas. Also, there's a lot of regulatory costs? Well, that's because cities in the San Jose area know that developers can't go anywhere else. They can only develop in the cities because of the urban growth boundaries. And so they have no reason to not charge them huge impact fees or impose an onerous permitting process on them. So when places become unaffordable, like San Jose, like Portland, what are the solutions? The solutions you hear are things like rent control. Well, every economist in the world knows that when you apply rent control, it's going to make housing less affordable because developers are not going to want to build as much. So Portland came up with the idea, well, if a landlord raises the rent by more than 10%, they'll have to pay $4,500 to the tenants for their moving costs. You didn't know about that? That's been in place for about 6 months now. They just made it permanent, okay? So are you going to want to build an apartment building for people if you're going to have to pay their moving costs just because you raised their rent? No, it's not going to happen. So it's just going to make housing less affordable. Then there's the idea that, well, we'll blame developers. We'll make developers provide more affordable housing. We'll require them to provide 20% of the units they build for less than their cost to people who are low income. The problem is that means they have to raise the price on everything else to make up for it. And that raises the general price of all housing in the region, because if new houses cost more than you're selling your house, you can charge more for it because a new house costs more. So the planners call this inclusionary zoning because they say they're including low-income people, whereas they claim that single-family zoning is exclusionary zoning. Well, what's the effect of inclusionary and exclusionary? Who's being included? Who's being excluded? Well, it turns out the cities that have the inclusionary zoning, like San Francisco, Los Angeles, and Honolulu, their black populations are declining. They're moving away. I'm sorry to say this, but black per capita incomes are 60% of white per capita incomes. It's been that way for 50 years. Without getting into the reasons why, it's a shameful thing about America, but they're an interesting bellwether, because if they're moving away, it means low-income people are moving away. Whereas you go to places like Houston and Dallas and Atlanta that don't have any of these rules, they have exclusionary zoning, and yet black populations there are growing faster than the general population. Because even though they call it exclusionary zoning, it's just another lie. It's really much more inclusive because it's much more affordable. Now, so far, the black population of the Portland area hasn't declined, but what we've seen is their quality of housing has declined. Since 2000, the percentage of whites living in single-family homes declined by 0.1%. The percentage of blacks living in single-family homes has declined by 25%, more than 25%. They've had to move from single-family homes to apartments because the single-family homes that they were renting have been gentrified and turned into yuppie homes, and they've been forced into apartments, generally out in East Portland. So the whole idea that densification, the other approach they're taking to make housing affordable is densification. This has become the latest excuse that urban planners have to densify our communities. And so they're saying if we just build enough density, it'll be more affordable. The problem with that is that high-density housing costs more to build. 5-story buildings cost 50% more per square foot than 2-story buildings. And anything above 5 stories costs 68% more per square foot than 2-story buildings. So it's only affordable if you're willing to accept a tiny apartment. Like Portland recently approved the construction of an 11-story building in the Pearl District. It's going to be affordable housing, 68 units of affordable housing. They're only going to cost, if they sell them, about $250,000 each for 660 square feet per apartment. $330 a square foot. That's affordable. Affordable tiny homes. Furthermore, as regions have gotten denser, their affordability has declined. San Francisco's density has increased by about 50% since 1970. their affordability, their valued income ratios have tripled. In other words, they've gotten a lot less affordable. Los Angeles, the same thing. In fact, how dense does Portland have to be to become more affordable? Right now, Portland is about, the Portland area is about 3,500 people per square mile, and our valued income ratio is 4.2, which means you have to earn a lot of money to be able to afford a house, okay? So what if they made the entire Portland area as dense as the city of Portland, which is about 4,500 people per square mile? Well, the valued income ratio there is 4.9. Well, how about if we made it as dense as Boston, which is 12,000 people per square mile, 3 times as dense it is today? The valued income ratio doubles. How about as dense as San Francisco, which is 16,000 people a square mile, 4 times the density? Well, that valued income ratio is over 8. New York City, they're 27,000 people per square mile. Their valued income ratio is almost 9. Manhattan, as the densest county in America, New York is 5 counties. Manhattan is 67,000 people per square mile, and their valued income ratio is more than 10. So the denser you get, the less affordable you are. The whole claim that density is a solution to affordability is another lie. And I'm not just picking a few numbers out. If you look at all the urban areas in America and compare their density and affordability, there's a clear trend. If you increase density by about 1,000 people per square mile, the valued income ratio increases by about 0.65. So if you increase it from 3,000 to 5,000, you might go from less than 3, which is affordable, to more than 4, which is unaffordable. Why do we need all this densification? Originally, they said we need to do it to preserve farmland. But all the urban areas in America only cover 3% of the land in this country. It's about 100 million acres. We have 1.1 billion acres of farmland in this country, and we only use about 1/3 of them for growing crops. And that's declining, not because we're sprawling across our farmland, but because our per acre crop yields are growing faster than our population for all major crops. And so we need less and less farmland a year. So what we're doing is we're sacrificing something that's very important to us, housing, in order to preserve something that's extremely abundant. It's silly. And of course, Oregon is even worse than Portland. All the urban areas in Oregon only add up to about 1.25% of the state. You add all rural developments, railroads and agri-pack structures and things like that, it's another 0.9%. So 97.5% of Oregon is rural open space. What are we trying to preserve here? Even just the Willamette Valley, the Thousand Friends of Oregon hired a bunch of economists to figure out what would happen if we got rid of all the land use rules in the Willamette Valley. And what they said was, well, right now, about 6% of the Willamette Valley has been developed, and over the next 50 years, that'll increase to 6.5%. But if we got rid of all the land use rules and let the free market rule, it would be 7.5%. So to save 1% of the Willamette Valley from development, we've made housing unaffordable, and we're doing nothing about it. We're making these token policies. Any politician who says they want housing affordability, who doesn't want to abolish the urban growth boundaries, isn't serious. Not expand the urban growth boundaries, but abolish them. They have to be abolished to make housing affordable. Now, the other reason why they want to have density is because they say if we're dense, we won't drive as much, and driving is evil. Well, it turns out transit uses as much energy and produces as much greenhouse gases as cars. But even if it didn't, it turns out a study by an economist from the University of California, Irvine, found that although there was a statistically significant effect of density on driving, it was a tiny effect. It was too small to be useful to try to save energy or reduce greenhouse gas emissions or whatever. In fact, if we just encourage people to buy plug-in hybrids, or something like that, more fuel-efficient cars, will have a much bigger effect on greenhouse gas emissions than we will by trying to get people to live in higher densities. And you want to have low-impact homes? Don't build a tiny home. Build yourself a 2,000 square foot zero-energy home that has lots of solar panels and things like that. For $125 a square foot, you can build a home that uses zero energy, that lives off the grid. $125 a square foot. Instead, we're spending $330 a square foot building tiny little apartments for people. It's stupid. So, don't believe anything anybody says about housing affordability unless they're saying we need to get rid of the urban growth boundaries. Otherwise, they're not serious. All right, back to transportation. I want to know, all right, we've been building all this light rail, we've been doing all this work. How well has it worked? How much good has it done for the Portland area? Well, when I was growing up in Portland, I took the bus a lot. I remember the red Rosie buses, I remember the orange TriMet buses, and I remember in 1980, TriMet had an aggressive general manager who was a friend of mine. His name was Stephen McCarthy, and he was doing a lot of things to promote ridership. And in 1980, 10% of Portland area commuters took the bus to work. 10%. Okay? Then they built the first light rail line. It opened in 1986. Now, I don't want to say that nobody uses the light rail, but a few years ago, a light rail train came into downtown Portland from the airport with only one passenger on board. Now, coyotes like to go where they know they can find solitude from people. And although this picture was in the Oregonian, I'm told he was actually a repeat customer. Okay, so since 1980, we've built this huge network. We've got 5 light rail lines. We've got a commuter rail line. We've got those streetcar lines. And today, I'm proud to say that the percentage of Portland area commuters taking transit to work is all the way up to 8%, from 10% in 1980. That's how well light rail has worked. Okay? Every year, the Portland Business Alliance takes a 100% census of downtown employers. And one of the questions they ask is, how do your employees get to work? They started in 2001, which happened to be the year the streetcar line opened. And in 2001, almost as many people took transit to work as drove. As of 2016, however, the number of people driving to work dramatically increased. The number of people walking and bicycling to work increased, and the number of people taking transit to work decreased by almost exactly the same number as the number of people, as the increase in walking and bicycling. So we built the streetcar, we built all this housing in the Pearl District, we built all this housing in the South Waterfront District, and we expected people to take the streetcar from that housing to downtown, and they very quickly found that they could walk or bicycle faster than the 7-mile-an-hour streetcar. So they don't take the streetcar, and guess what? The people who were living there are people who were formerly taking TriMet to downtown, and so they aren't taking TriMet anymore. So all this planning has done harm to the transit system. We didn't need to build the streetcar, we didn't need to build light rail, maybe we just needed to build some inner-city housing. Since 2012, TriMet ridership has been on a downward trend. Ridership in 2017 was the lowest it's been in any year since 2006. And there are several reasons for that. This is part of a national trend. Of the 50 largest urban areas, transit ridership is growing only in one, Seattle. And I don't want to get into why that is, but there's several reasons why transit ridership is declining almost everywhere else. One is Uber and Lyft and other shared ride systems. Chariot is a Ford-owned bus company that is competing against public buses in San Francisco, New York, and other cities. They're taking away riders from the public bus transit systems. Another is we seem to have a stability in fuel prices. I'm not sure you'd call them low prices, but they seem to be pretty stable, and so people have adjusted. They've got their fuel-efficient cars that they want, and so they're driving more and more. Our driving is increasing again much faster than transit ridership. A third reason is you've heard about crumbling infrastructure. The truth is our highways and our bridges aren't really crumbling. The only infrastructure that really is crumbling is our rail transit infrastructure. That's because the politicians decide where to spend the money, and they'd rather spend money building new rail lines and maintaining the old ones. And so then you get things like this. This was a crash of the Washington Metro system that killed 9 people in 2009. It was because they hadn't maintained their signaling system. And I go to Washington, D.C., the great Satan, about 3 times a year, and the metro system has dramatically declined in quality. When I first started going there, it was like walking into 2001: A Space Odyssey. Now it's like walking into Blade Runner. So, because of the decline of the quality of rail transit systems, and New York, Washington, that's really where most transit ridership takes place, is in those big cities. We're seeing transit ridership decline there. So, why is Portland still eager to build light rail when all these things are true? Well, a lot of it comes down to federal funding. Most federal transportation dollars are distributed using formulas based on things like the population of your state, the land area of your state, and stuff like that. So you know pretty much how much you're going to get. You can't really change your land area. You can't really change your population in the short run. So you're going to get that much money. You try to spend it effectively, okay? Let's say I was going to say to everybody here, the next time you want to go for a trip somewhere, I'll pay for your trip, just that one trip. And I'll give you $5 per trip. Well, some of you might say, well, $5, I'll take the bus. That'll give me a round trip to just about anywhere I want to go in the Portland area. Now, the other way that transportation is funded is the way that they use to fund light rail. It's called the competitive grant system. What it is, it's a big bucket of money, and whatever city builds the most expensive rail line gets the most money. So cities are in a race to build as expensive a rail line as they can. So let's say I did that to you. Let's say I'll pay your way to on your next trip, no matter how much it costs. Well, some of you might take the bus, and some of you might decide to go in a stretch limousine, gold-plated, because, hey, I'm paying whatever it costs, right? So that's what they're doing. They're gold-plating the light rail. And as I think I showed you before, construction costs have shot up, way, way up, because of that competition. Now, to his credit, Donald Trump has proposed to totally eliminate that form of funding for transit. And so far, Congress hasn't supported him, but they haven't resisted him either. He said new transit projects should be funded by the communities that want to build them. Well, if Portland had to fund all of it, if they didn't get any money from the feds, they wouldn't have built light rail in the first place. They certainly wouldn't be building any more. The question is, what's Congress going to do? What's going to happen to Congress? What happens when a Democrat gets elected president, which is inevitable? It might not be in 2020, it might not be in 2024, but eventually a Democrat will get elected and they'll start throwing money at transit again. The problem is, transit's on its way out. We've already seen the beginnings of the decline, and it's going to get a lot more because of this. This is Waymo, which used to be called Google. It's their driverless car program. These are their driverless cars running around near Phoenix. Is it Crandall? What's the name of the town? Anyway, Chandler, Arizona. Driverless cars are the transportation of the future. And the benefits are going to be enormous. I know some people like to drive their own car, but one benefit is when you get a lot of driverless cars on the road, because most congestion is caused by slow human reflexes, driverless cars are going to have faster reflexes, so a lot of congestion is going to go away. It's going to be universal mobility. You can be 9 years old, you can be 90 years old, you can be blind, whatever, you can get in your car and go where you want to go. Well, I'm looking forward to be able to send my dogs to the vet in our driverless car, because the vet doesn't want to see me, they just want to see my dogs and my credit card. Faster speeds, because there's going to be a lot less congestion, a huge increase in safety. 90% of traffic fatalities are driver error caused. So probably will reduce fatalities at least 50%, perhaps as much as 90%. And it'll be greener because you'll be able to build cars that are lighter weight because they're not going to be crashing into each other all the time. Now, Ford Motor Company, a year and a half ago, announced that they were going to be mass producing cars without a steering wheel, without a gas pedal, without a brake pedal by 2021. I thought that was pretty bold. Last year, General Motors announced that not only were they going to be mass producing them by 2019, they had already set up their production lines for them, and they had designed a car. Basically, they took a car and then they took a steering wheel out. I thought it was a dumb design, but they're ahead of Ford. Meanwhile, Waymo is saying, nah, 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 we're already doing it. Whoops, sorry. There we go. As I say, in Chandler, Arizona, they have a car service. You can call their car up. The car will come to you without a driver, will pick you up, take you where you want to go in Chandler, drop you off, and then it'll go pick up someone else. No driver involved at all, period. Now, the interesting thing is they're looking bored. It isn't even exciting anymore. Now, the Obama administration wanted to put in what they call a vehicle-to-infrastructure system, which would allow traffic signals to electronically communicate with your car to tell you what color the signal, tell your car what the color of the signal was. And it would also allow it to tell your car if there was a traffic pileup down the road. But also, it would allow the government to take control of your car. So if you had used your quota of vehicle miles this month, they could just turn your car off. Now, the Obama administration never bragged about that part, but that was a possibility. And since the state of Washington is actually passing a law mandating a 50% reduction in per capita driving by the year 2040, it's not hard to imagine some of our left-wing legislators proposing to say, hey, we got this technology, we can turn people's cars off if they're exceeding their limit. Of course, we would be exempted from that, but everybody else would still have to pay for it. So, fortunately, we killed that idea. Trump administration is against it, but the main thing is none of the car companies that were making driverless cars, Waymo or Tesla or Uber or anybody, wanted it because they didn't trust the government to install it and maintain it. They can't even maintain the streets or keep the traffic signals coordinated, so how are they going to maintain this? So instead, all driverless car technology you're hearing about today is based on extremely precise maps. These maps are going to show where every traffic stripe is, where every curb is, where every signal is, so the car knows where to look for a red or green or yellow signal, where every stop sign is. And so these maps are going to be the starting point for the car. Now, if there's a detour, if there's a bicyclist on the road, the cars will be able to deal with that too. But the starting point is the maps, which means when General Motors gets its cars going in 2019 or Ford in 2021 or whatever, those cars will only be able to go in places that have been mapped. So now we had a race to see who could get the first driverless cars. Now we have a race to see who can map the most of America the soonest. There's at least 3 companies making maps. One is owned by Ford. One is owned by a consortium of BMW, Mercedes, Volkswagen, and Google. And one is owned by General Motors. There's probably others. So they're racing to map your community. And when they get their driverless cars in mass production, unless your community is mapped, you're not going to be able to call one of those driverless cars up. I kind of think my hometown of Camp Sherman is not going to be high on the priority list. Although there was a story that TriMet wanted to build a light rail line to Bend, and somebody said, well, they should build it through Camp Sherman because they can't think of a better use of transportation dollars than to put a light rail line in Randal O'Toole's front yard. But I don't think that's going to apply to the driverless car mapping companies. So what's going to happen is, in about 2020, give or take a year, you'll be able to start getting driverless cars in major cities around the country, the cities that have been mapped. Soon after that, there'll be people who will be selling kits that will retrofit your car. If you have a car that's been made in the last 5 years, it already has most of the technology on board to make it a driverless car. So a retrofitting kit might cost anywhere from $2,000 to $10,000, and it'll make your car driverless. By 2022, I'd say most major cities would have shared driverless cars, but it'll be 2025 or so before you'll be able to buy a driverless car, because the companies, manufacturers are going to figure you're not going to want to buy a car if you can't get to the grandkids' house because they live outside of a mapped area. So it'll be 2025 before most of the places in America are mapped. By 2030, one optimist has predicted that 95% of all travel will be by driverless car. I think it's more like half, but that might be conservative. By 2040, they'll start talking about closing some roads to human-driven cars because human drivers are too dangerous. I have a friend who says he gets a testosterone thrill from having his hands on the steering wheel. You know, some people get their testosterone thrills from horseback riding. And there are still places to horseback ride, but you can't do it on an interstate freeway. I told him, well, you know, once you get a driverless car, then the open container law goes out the window. We were sitting in a bar at the time, so his eyes lit up. He had just gotten a divorce, and so I added, also, you and your girlfriend will be able to go in the back seat while the car is driving somewhere. So he realized he could get his testosterone thrills in other ways than by having his hands on the steering wheel of the car. All right, well, I think I've taken enough of your time here. I want to do some shameless self-promotion and then take a few questions. I've written several books about this subject. One is called Gridlock, Why We're Stuck in Traffic and What to Do About It. There's a whole chapter on driverless cars. There's a whole chapter on light rail. There's a whole there's chapters on all different kinds of transportation. And that book was published by the Cato Institute. There's a few copies up in front for sale. I think the list price is $25. We're selling them. Actually, I'm giving them away, but my autograph is $20. I did bring a couple copies each of some other books. American Nightmare is about the housing issue and why we have such horrendous problems with housing. Best Laid Plans is kind of a catch-all book that looked at a lot of different planning issues. And then The Vanishing Automobile is really about Portland and what's wrong with Portland. And I'm proud to say, in about 6 months, my next book will come out called The Romance of the Rails, Why the Passenger Trains We Love Are Not the Transportation We Need. I love passenger trains, and I wish I could ride them every day, but I don't think other people should have to subsidize my hobby, and that's what this is all about. So most of those books are $20, The Vanishing Automobile is $15. If you don't want to spend money, go to the cato.org website. I've got a bunch of papers, more than 24 papers you can download. Almost all of them are either about housing affordability or transportation. One's on driverless cars. That's cato.org. Also go to ti.org. That's my personal website. ti.org is the anti-planner. I'm the anti-planner, and I write every day on planning problems around the world. All right, question.
I wanted to know what you thought about, well, John Charles gave us a nice talk about toll roads and asked us to rethink our natural aversion to toll roads. What do you think about toll roads?
Well, it's hard to say with a bunch of political candidates in the room, but yeah, toll roads are the solution to congestion. I said anybody who cares about housing affordability and doesn't want to abolish the urban growth boundaries isn't serious. If you're really serious about relieving congestion, then toll roads or mileage-based user fees are the solution. And here's the reason why. And maybe John told you this, but he learned it from me. When roads are when traffic is moving at speed on a freeway, you can move 2,000 vehicles an hour. But when it gets jammed up, you're moving only 1,000 or fewer vehicles per hour. So by making sure it never gets congested, you're actually doubling the throughput of the road. So instead of tolling people off the road, which is what they say, oh, we're going to make it so only rich people can use the road, we're actually tolling people onto the road. We're going to make it possible for more people to get to where they want to go at rush hour. And that's really important. Congestion costs Americans more than $1/3 trillion per year. 3 years, $1 trillion. And it seems to me it would be imperative to do something about that. Now, the problem is, it's really hard to do politically. So I'm hoping driverless cars are going to solve a lot of it, but then eventually we're going to have to go to a system like that. By the way, I'm a volunteer in the mileage-based user fee program. I encourage you to volunteer if you've got a car made since '96. It's a great program. You basically pay by the mile and you get your gas taxes refunded. Yeah?
You showed a picture of a gold-plated limousine.
Is that your car? I'm sorry.
You know, my question is that actually a cheaper solution than light rail?
I haven't sat down and figured it out for Portland yet. I can tell you for the commuter train that goes from Wilsonville to Beaverton, it would be cheaper to give every single daily round-trip rider of that train a new Toyota Prius every other year for the next 30 years than to run that train. Now, Portland Light Rail is actually one of the more heavily used light rails because they devastated their bus system to do it. So I don't know what the exact numbers are for that is, but there are light rail lines in the country that are really have pathetic ridership, and in those cases it would be true. It would be cheaper to take them to work by limousine than by the light rail. Yeah.
Do you ever solve homelessness anywhere in the U.S. in the city?
Affordable housing programs are programs aimed at helping low-income people. That's different from housing affordability, which is the general housing prices for everybody in an area. And we see places like Portland saying, well, we're going to build more affordable housing, and we're going to make the owners of existing housing pay for it, so it's going to increase the cost of existing housing. That doesn't make housing more affordable. If you make all housing more affordable, then fewer people are going to need affordable housing, and you don't need to spend as much public money on that. Any other questions? All right, well, thank you very much. Thank you.